Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm just going to walk you through government policy and impact on an economy. Now, the reason why I chose to do this presentation is there's a lot of misinformation out there, or I shouldn't say necessary misinformation. There's misunderstandings of basically a role of a government in terms of the overall management of an economy. And a lot of that has to do with the way media portrays it and even business itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down in a succinct way to kind of cover out what goes on. My presentation itself is only my perspective, and it comes from my academic background with teaching a public finance course. It also comes from my background in working in business for the better part of almost 3 decades to kind of understand what it takes to compete and what the role of government is overall, the development of policies to support a business climate. Here's a little bit about myself. I'm a CPA CGA by trade, but I really get into from academia, industry, financial solutions, because I'm all about solutions. I'm agnostic to any sort of party. What I am about is about solutions and getting the information out. So I'll talk about government policy, I'll talk about taxation, and I'll give you and frame it in terms of how things work. Now, typically with government policies, and this is from municipal, provincial, federally, depending on geographically you're distributed in the world, but there's similar types of way that government runs. But it makes the laws and regulations. It sets up the taxation rules for property, for payroll, for consumption taxes, infrastructure. It builds infrastructure, it supports it, it puts the permits together to build it. Environmental, it sets the rules in terms of the environmental standards. Education, sets the education in terms of basically post-secondary school as well as primary and secondary school education. Hydro, it has provincial responsibility around the hydro rates and setting the hydro policies. That shouldn't say education, it should say healthcare. Healthcare should be part of it. Skills and development, that's training. But these are not all the policies, but these are some of what these things get into, and this is what gets involved. Now, what does the government do? Like anything else, it collects revenue. It needs that revenue to support its social programs. And the major sources of revenue for any government are corporate taxes, personal taxes, payroll taxation, and consumption tax. Now, payroll taxation, you need to be careful here, because if it's pension type of funding, it goes into a liability account. Same with UI, it goes into a liability account, but we still pay it out. Corporate tax, there's multiple issues with that. That's a corporate tax rate, but there's also rules with R&D credits and all that. That's part of the Income Tax Act. Personal, that's the taxation rates that we deduct from you based on your income. Consumption taxes, these are typically the GST, provincial sales tax, the charge at the point of sale, or how you bill things out. So they're a tax. Okay, so that's where the government gets its revenue. Now, what the government then does is takes this bucket of money and redistributes that income. That's where you hear redistribution of wealth back down to social programs. So it takes a bucket of that revenue and redistributes it down to education, healthcare, public safety, public works, childcare, and some other departments. But in general, that's how it works in terms of the flow. So if you don't have a revenue base and you hammer that revenue base, that you take jobs away, or you hammer that and you're a high unemployment, then you have less taxations to fund social programs, and it puts pressure on those programs. Here's a key thing of a government assessment. Government do not work in a competitive marketplace. They provide services and social programs because they are required. They don't go to market and bid for them. So that's one of the things people don't understand. In a business, if I'm making a product like a widget, I have to price that widget in the market that I can compete and I can sell it. In government, that's not how it operates. 2, businesses put a lot of restraint in terms of their pricing, especially small, medium-sized business, because they have cost pressures. So not able to pay accordingly because of the cost pressures. Government's restraint isn't the same way. Now, do they have embodied restraint? Yes, they do. But the problem is they've not really enforced it. So that's why you really need governments to look at compensation, benefits, and pension reforms. Now let's look at the flow of taxation for a business. I'm a business, I operate. I have employees, there's payroll tax. I have income, that's corporate tax. If I'm bringing goods and services in, that's excise tax. Those are part of my costs. That means my labor costs are going to include payroll taxes. My overhead likely will include laid down cost of excise duty, which impacts my inventory pricing. Okay? Corporate taxes reduces the amount of money I retain that I can put back into my business. So either I give it to shareholders or I retain it for business investment. So if I'm in a high taxation area, then I'm taking money out of my business, and then I'm not going to put that much back into it. Consumption taxes. This is what we pay when you go buy a loaf of bread or a new car. That's the GST. So if you're paying more, that's less money you have for other things. So that being said, if you frame it in the overall global look, most countries, 2/3 of their GDP is driven by consumer spending. That's critical. Okay, now mind you, get in countries like China, it's probably not like that. But most of the G20 countries, that's what drives it. And that's something to bear in mind. So if I'm a business, I have to be competitive. And to be competitive, I have to watch my costs. So if I have a government that's imposing more taxation, whether it's carbon, hiking payroll tax, that impacts my costs. That impacts my profitability, impacts my ability to compete in the marketplace. And that's something that's not really discussed. Let's talk about personal now. You live in a house. You might rent. You're paying that with after-tax income. So if I increase taxation rates, like I bring in an ORPP or bring in a carbon tax or something like that, that's going to put taxations in. On the personal side, if I look at another registered pension, I'm taking that money away. I'm taking less money for you to spend on other things. If I have less money to spend on other things, I'm going to drop consumer spending down. If I drop consumer spending down, I'm going to impact the economy. So that's why you have to be very careful on the policies you bring in on taxation, on how you spend. Because today's debt is tomorrow's taxes or spending cuts. And that's not something that's discussed. Let's talk about the marketplace itself. Businesses go out there and have to price their product. They have to be competitive. Okay? They also have to be able to get their products to market. They also have to be able to focus on driving their business. They have to focus on being able to compete internationally. So what does government do? It has to put the policies in play to make that level playing field good for business investment. So the more red tape you bring in, it doesn't help business investment. They have to spend more time. If you don't have trade investment deals, companies can't expand into those marketplaces. You can't just walk into China and open up doors. If you add more payroll costs, business is going to look at to cut back hours. So in essence, the government can dictate certain policies. Okay, those policies will impact business. Business also will do certain things that it can do in its own control in terms of growing its customer base. So there's a mix of things, but it was never going to be one policy that will determine how an economy goes. And that's the misnomer that people get into. It's multiple policies that help achieve the balance that brings a strong economy and supports social programs. So that's why when I've seen stuff lately, well, negative interest rates, I've seen stimulus funding, I've seen a lot of determination to put more in foreign aid. Well, all those are nice to do, but the reality is, if you don't have oversight, and you don't have restraint, and you don't set priorities, guess what happens? That money doesn't go to where it's intended to, and it doesn't benefit the maximization of what needs to be done. And that's something that many people need to discuss or bring these issues up whether they talk to a municipal politician, provincial, or federal. These are things you should talk about. So that's the reason why I did this presentation, is to walk you through the issues in terms of what's required so people understand that it isn't that easy when you look at policies. Thank you.